You know it's going to be a bad day when your barn gets red tagged before breakfast. I was halfway through my coffee when I saw her Sandra Temple, the HOA president, marching up my driveway in heels way too high for gravel and a clipboard clenched like it was a weapon. "Jonathan Kessler," she yelled, like we were in a courtroom instead of my front yard. "That barn is a safety hazard, it's an eyesore, and it violates our community standards." I'm not exactly the type to lose my cool, but I had to bite the inside of my cheek. That barn. It was built by my grandfather, and I'd just finished reinforcing the beams and replacing the roof last season. Stood through 2 tornadoes and a record snowstorm. Safer than her Botox appointments, that's for sure. "What exactly is the hazard, Sandra?" I asked, stepping out onto the porch. Because unless you're allergic to heritage, I fail to see the emergency. There's rusted hardware, and I received anonymous complaints about children playing inside. Someone could get hurt. It's a liability. Anonymous, I raised an eyebrow. "You mean you complained?" She flinched, then tried to cover it with fake concern. "Jonathan, I'm just trying to protect our community. If you don't voluntarily take it down, the HOA will issue an official notice." That was rich, considering 2 weeks ago I caught her husband rewiring their backyard lighting without a permit. I didn't argue. I nodded like I was considering it. "All right, Sandra, I'll get some inspectors out here. If it's unsafe, I'll handle it." She looked pleased with herself, like she'd just sunk my battleship. "Glad to hear it. I'll make a note that you're cooperating." What she didn't know was that I already had the barn inspected last fall, fully up to code. But if she wanted to play this game, I had no problem inviting the city inspectors back this time to take a look at everything. 3 days later, 2 city inspectors rolled up in a white truck. I met them out front with a folder of my own permits, inspection reports, even a few photos of the barn's interior. I didn't say a word about Sandra yet. I just let them do their job. One of them, a guy named Doug, whistled low as he looked over the structure. "This barn's in better shape than most houses I see." "Appreciate it," I said. "Take your time, though. I want everything documented, thoroughly." They spent the next hour going over every board and beam. When they were done, I led them back to the driveway. That's when Sandra strutted over like she was about to be crowned queen. "Well," she asked, "is it condemned?" Doug frowned at her, flipping through his clipboard. "No, ma'am, this barn meets all safety codes. In fact, it's exceptionally maintained." Sandra's face twitched, but she recovered quickly. "That's surprising, but while you're here, maybe you could take a look at the common areas. We've had some complaints about uneven sidewalks and exposed electrical boxes." Doug and the other inspector, a sharp-eyed woman named Renee, exchanged a look. "Sure," Renee said. "Actually, we were going to suggest that ourselves." I watched from my porch as they walked off with Sandra. I wasn't done yet. If she wanted to drag me through the mud, I was going to make sure they saw every crack in the HOA's foundation, literally. Doug and Renee didn't even make it halfway down the sidewalk before Doug tripped over a raised slab of concrete. It didn't knock him down, but it definitely caught his attention. He crouched, ran a hand over the edge, then pointed to a jagged metal conduit poking out of a nearby utility box. "This exposed?" he asked. Sandra's lips tightened. "That's part of a long-term beautification project." "We're in the process of updating," Doug cut her off. "Beautification doesn't mean leaving live wires and tripping hazards in a public walkway. When was this last inspected?" "I'd have to check our records," she said, a little too quickly. Renee scribbled something on her clipboard. "Let's keep going." They didn't just walk, they inspected. 15 minutes later, they'd found 3 more cracked sidewalks, a storm drain clogged with what looked like landscaping debris, and a retaining wall bowing dangerously near the tennis courts. I didn't follow them. I stayed on my porch, sipping my lukewarm coffee and letting the wind carry the conversation back to me in pieces. "Did you know about this?" Renee asked sharply at one point. "That wall's been like that for years," Sandra replied. "No one's ever complained. Not how that works," Doug said flatly. By the time they circled back to the street, Sandra looked less like a queen and more like someone trying to hold in a sneeze during a wedding ceremony. She didn't look at me as she passed. Doug came up my driveway again, this time with Renee beside him. "You're good to go, Mr. Kessler. Your barn's in better condition than most community buildings we see." "I appreciate that," I said, folding the inspection report into my folder. "And the common areas?" Renee gave a dry laugh. "Let's just say your HOA is going to be very busy." They left without another word to Sandra, who was now peering toward the clubhouse like she'd rather be anywhere else. I watched her walk off, heels clicking like a metronome of denial. The next morning, things escalated. I woke up to a notice taped to my mailbox, an official HOA letterhead, but the paper was crooked and the ink smeared. It claimed I had intimidated inspectors and obstructed the board's efforts to ensure safety compliance. I read it 3 times, then laughed. It was so badly written it looked like it had been drafted in a panic. They were trying to flip the script, and poorly at that. I scanned the letter, annotated it with a few notes, and drove over to City Hall. I knew someone in the Planning and Development Office, Marcy, a former zoning analyst who now handled oversight complaints involving private associations. We'd gone to high school together, and she knew exactly how these boards operated when no one was watching. She read the letter, set it down, and stared at me over her glasses. "You didn't intimidate anyone, did you?" Doug tripped over their sidewalk. "That's the closest I got to a threat." She rolled her eyes. "We've had issues with this HOA before. Misused funds, delayed maintenance, and a lot of creative paperwork. Anything I can do to help that along?" I asked. Marcy tapped her pen against her desk. "Actually, yes. If you're willing to make a formal statement and provide your documentation, we can open an investigation. The inspector's report is one thing, but if we can tie it to a pattern of negligence or falsified records..." "I've got copies of everything," I said. "And I've got a neighbor who used to be a structural engineer. He's been concerned about that wall near the tennis courts for years." Marcy nodded slowly. "This could turn into something much bigger." 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from the city. It announced a formal audit of the HOA's infrastructure oversight and financial records, citing multiple code violations and possible mismanagement of community safety funds. It was addressed to the HOA board directly, with a carbon copy sent to the County Legal Affairs Division. I didn't have to wait long for the fireworks. That Saturday, I was repairing a section of fencing when a black SUV pulled up in front of my house. Out stepped Carl Jensen, the HOA's treasurer, not someone who usually got involved in neighborly disputes. He was the type who wore suits to trash pickups and always had a Bluetooth in his ear, even when no one was on the line. "You made your point, Kessler," he said without preamble. Was all this really necessary? Point being that they shouldn't fabricate code violations. I leaned on the fence post. "Yeah, seemed pretty necessary." "We're going to be audited," he said. "You understand what that means?" "I do, and I think you do too. Which is probably why you're here." He took a deep breath. "Look, Sandra may have overstepped, Carl," I interrupted. "I'm not interested in whatever half apology you're about to mumble. Your board tried to weaponize safety regulations to force me to tear down a building that predates the HOA itself. You sent me a fake violation letter, and now you're in damage control." He looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he pulled out his phone and tapped a few times. "We're going to call an emergency meeting. You should be there." "Let me guess, closed session?" Carl hesitated. "Yes." "Then no," I said, turning back to my tools, "but I'll be watching the minutes closely." He stood there a moment longer, then walked off without another word. That was fine. I wasn't done either. Over the next week, I spoke with other residents. Quiet ones. The ones who didn't show up to board meetings but had plenty to say in private. I heard stories about repair requests denied without explanation, fines issued for violations that didn't exist, and one elderly couple who'd been threatened with foreclosure over a misplaced garbage can. I asked each person the same thing. "Do you have documentation?" Most of them did. Photos, letters, even audio recordings of phone calls with board members. I compiled everything into a single dossier and handed it to Marcy the following Monday. "This is more than enough," she said. "We'll be forwarding this to the county attorney. If the board's been issuing false notices or misusing funds, it's going to come out. Keep me posted," I told her, "and let me know if you need anything else." The HOA's next monthly meeting was packed. Word had spread, and for the first time in years, residents actually showed up, some standing in the back because the folding chairs were full. Carl opened the meeting with a strained greeting. Sandra was noticeably absent. "We've been informed of an upcoming audit," he began. "We're cooperating fully and confident everything will be resolved quickly." Someone in the back scoffed, loudly. Another resident, a retired nurse named Ellen, stood up and raised her hand. "Is it true the HOA sent out fake violation letters?" Carl adjusted his tie. "I wouldn't characterize them as fake, so yes," she asked. He didn't respond. Someone else asked about the exposed wiring near the pool gate. Another asked why the tennis court wall hadn't been repaired in over 4 years. The questions kept coming, and for the first time the board didn't have answers. They had excuses. They had vague promises. But not answers. I didn't speak during the meeting. I just sat in the back and listened, watching the tide shift, watching people realize they weren't alone. Later that evening, as the crowd trickled out and the board members huddled in the corner, I caught Carl's eye. He looked pale, not angry, nervous. I gave him a single nod, not out of respect, out of certainty. They'd picked the wrong barn to target. And now the whole rotten scaffold they'd built was starting to crack. By Thursday morning, the HOA's grip on the neighborhood was unraveling like an old garden hose. The audit deadline loomed, and Carl had begun avoiding eye contact at the mailbox. Most of the board had gone silent, including Sandra, who hadn't been seen since the meeting. Her car sat untouched outside her house, tires caked in pollen and dust. People started whispering, but it was what I found on my doorstep that really pushed things over the edge: an envelope. No return address. Inside was a collection of scanned documents, some clearly photocopies of HOA invoices, others appearing to be internal memos. One page in particular caught my attention, a spreadsheet detailing maintenance allocations for the last 18 months. There were entries for repairs that had never happened, like clubhouse roof replacement and pool pump overhaul, each signed off by both Sandra and Carl. The amounts were staggering. Tens of thousands of dollars redirected for work that anyone with eyes could see had never been done. I flipped to the last page, a typed note. "Check account 418791. That's where it's going." I didn't know who had sent it, but I had a good guess. Someone inside the HOA who'd realized the ship was sinking and didn't want to go down with it. I drove straight to City Hall and met with Marcy again. When I handed her the envelope, she didn't say anything for a long time, just read. Her face hardened with each page. "They've been embezzling," she said finally. "This isn't just mismanagement, this is criminal." "Can you trace the account?" I asked. "I can't," she said. "But the district attorney's office can. And with this kind of paper trail, they'll want in." By that afternoon, Marcy had forwarded everything to the DA's Economic Crimes Unit. A formal investigation was launched the same day. The next morning, 2 unmarked vehicles parked outside the HOA's clubhouse. 3 plainclothes officers entered with warrant folders tucked under their arms. An hour later, they walked out dragging 2 laptops, a desktop tower, 4 boxes of files, and a visibly shaken office manager named Leela, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Word spread fast. By nightfall, neighbors were outside again, talking to each other, asking questions. I stood on my porch, listening to the low murmur of disbelief that hummed through the neighborhood. Janice from across the street walked over, arms crossed, face unreadable. "You were right," she said. "I didn't want to be," I replied. She nodded slowly. "We should have paid more attention. We let them run everything behind closed doors. Now's your chance to change that," I said. "They're not going to be in charge much longer." The next HOA meeting wasn't just packed, it was standing room only, with residents spilling out into the hallway and front steps. An interim chair, a soft-spoken woman named Loretta who'd always kept to herself, took the podium. She explained calmly and clearly that the board was under criminal investigation and that the city had temporarily frozen all HOA discretionary spending pending the outcome. Carl didn't show. Neither did Sandra, but their absence said everything. "I've spoken with the city attorney," Loretta said, "and they've made it clear that if we don't take steps to reform how this HOA operates, we could lose our charter entirely." A man in the back raised his hand. "What does that mean?" "That means," Loretta said, "the HOA could be dissolved." A stunned silence followed. Then slowly people started clapping, not loud at first, just a ripple, but it built. That night, I sat in my barn, no longer a target, no longer in question, and looked over the inspection report one more time. I wasn't sentimental, not usually. But there was something satisfying about knowing the very structure they tried to use to break me had become the catalyst for their unraveling. But the story wasn't over. The DA's office moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, subpoenas were issued. Carl was brought in for questioning, and so was the HOA's former accountant, who apparently hadn't been paid in over 6 months. That accountant, a wiry man named Dennis with a nervous laugh, turned out to be the linchpin. He came forward with emails, ones that showed Carl and Sandra had rerouted emergency repair funds into a personal shell company registered under Carl's brother's name. The paper trail was undeniable. More than $75,000 had vanished over 2 fiscal years, money meant for sidewalk repairs, lighting systems, and even fire alarm inspections. I wasn't surprised when Sandra was arrested. It happened early on a Tuesday morning. She didn't fight it. Just stepped out onto her porch in a robe and heels, hands already out. The cuffs clicked, the cruiser door shut, and the neighborhood exhaled. Carl followed 2 days later after trying to fly out of state without notifying investigators. Agents intercepted him at the airport. In the days that followed, the neighborhood transformed. Residents painted over the peeling signs that once proudly displayed the HOA's logo. The clubhouse's bulletin board, once filled with threatening notices and overdue balance sheets, now held sign-up sheets for new committees: gardening, safety, event planning. Real ones. Transparent ones. Loretta asked me to join the interim oversight committee. I said no at first. I'd done my part. But when she told me others had asked for me specifically, I reconsidered. At the first committee meeting, I laid out one simple rule. Every vote documented, every expenditure published. No secrets, no closed doors. We weren't rebuilding the HOA, we were replacing it with something better. One of the last things we did that month was vote to preserve the barn. We registered it as a historical structure with the city. Couldn't be torn down, couldn't be claimed by the HOA even if one ever came back. As I stood in front of it, plaque in hand, a few neighbors gathered around. "This place started everything," one of them said. "No," I replied. "Corruption started everything. This just survived it." And that was enough. The courthouse smelled like lemon disinfectant and old paper, clean but not comforting. I sat outside the hearing room in a wooden chair that had probably been there since the county was founded, flipping through my annotated copy of the inspector's report. I wasn't required to be there, but the prosecutor had asked me to testify about my experience with the HOA's false violation letter. Marcy had already submitted the original documents I'd turned in, but they needed a timeline, someone to connect the dots. A bailiff opened the door and gestured toward me. "Mr. Kessler, you're up." Inside, the room was quiet, not the dramatic kind of quiet you see on TV, but the kind that comes from too many people trying not to make noise. The judge, a woman with gray hair pulled tight into a bun, sat behind a desk stacked with folders. The county prosecutor, a sharply dressed man named Dalton Nguyen, gave me a brief nod as I took the witness chair. Carl was seated at the defendant's table. No tie today, just a wrinkled button-up and the dull look of someone who hadn't slept in days. Next to him sat his attorney, a man who looked more irritated than invested. Dalton approached the bench calmly and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we'd like to enter into record the testimony of Mr. Jonathan Kessler regarding Exhibit 17, the falsified violation notice sent under the HOA's authority." The judge gave a curt nod. "Proceed." Dalton turned to me. "Mr. Kessler, can you walk us through your first interaction with the Homeowners Association regarding your barn?" I kept my voice steady as I recounted everything: the early morning confrontation, the clipboard, the vague accusations of danger. I described the barn's history, the recent repairs, and most importantly, the prior inspection that had cleared it. When I got to the part about the violation letter, Dalton held up a laminated copy. "Is this the document you received?" I leaned forward. "That's it. The signature at the bottom is Sandra Temple's." "And what action did you take after receiving it?" "I went to the city," I said, "requested another inspection. I also gave them a copy of this letter, and that's when they noticed discrepancies that led to their own investigation." Dalton turned to the judge. "We'd also like to submit the city's follow-up report, which documented numerous public safety hazards under the HOA's responsibility, none of which were previously disclosed by the board." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Including the retaining wall collapse," Dalton nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And that failure was directly tied to funds that were earmarked for its repair but were instead diverted, as the financial audit now confirms." Carl stared ahead, jaw clenched, but his attorney leaned over and whispered something. He didn't respond. Dalton moved on. "Mr. Kessler, were you aware at the time that the HOA had been fabricating maintenance expenses under a shell company?" "No," I said. "Not until I received anonymous documents a few weeks later. I forwarded them to planning and development immediately." Dalton thanked me and stepped back. Carl's attorney declined cross-examination. The judge made a note, then dismissed me from the stand. I didn't stay for the rest of the hearing. I didn't need to. The evidence was overwhelming, and the court had already granted a motion to freeze Carl's personal assets pending restitution. But as I stepped into the hallway, I spotted someone standing near the vending machines. Leela, the HOA's former office manager. She looked different. Hair down, no clipboard, no carefully rehearsed smile. "You testified?" I asked. She nodded, her voice quiet. "I kept copies of everything." They thought I was just filing them away, but I knew something was wrong when invoices started doubling for things that never got done. "You did the right thing," I said. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I was afraid. But then I saw what they did to you and figured it was only a matter of time before they came after someone else." We parted ways without saying much else. She had her own life to rebuild, and I had a community waiting to see what came next. A week later, the judge handed down a preliminary ruling. Carl and Sandra would face separate criminal trials for financial fraud, falsifying municipal documents, and misappropriation of community funds. The HOA board was formally dissolved by court order, and a temporary oversight committee led by Loretta was placed under city supervision until a new structure could be voted in. The city also announced they would be installing their own safety inspectors for the neighborhood's public areas at the HOA's expense. But the final nail came from the state attorney general's office. Because of the scale of the fraud, over $90,000 misused, affecting over 70 residents, the state designated the case as a community-level financial crime, triggering enhanced penalties. Sandra's shell company was frozen, and Carl's brother, who had served as the company's silent owner, was also indicted. It wasn't just negligence anymore. It was organized fraud, and the law was treating it that way. Back in the neighborhood, things changed fast. The old HOA sign was taken down, replaced by a temporary placard from the city's municipal management team. They held open meetings twice a month at the community center, real open meetings, where anyone could speak. Minutes were published online. Budgets were posted on the bulletin board. No more closed sessions. No more sudden fines. One afternoon, Loretta stopped by my place with a clipboard, not the kind Sandra used, but a battered one covered in sticky notes and coffee stains. "I wanted to ask if you'd consider helping us write the new bylaws," she said. "We're starting from scratch. No more vague language, no more loopholes." I hesitated. "I'm not a politician," she shrugged. "You don't have to be. Just someone who's not afraid to speak up when something doesn't make sense." I agreed, on the condition that every clause we drafted had to be reviewed by at least 3 non-committee members before being finalized. No more rubber stamps. No more blind trust. We worked late into the evenings for the next month. I wasn't alone. Ellen, the retired nurse, joined us. So did Marvin, the structural engineer who'd warned about the retaining wall years ago. Even Leela came by and offered to help organize the records going forward. Everyone brought something to the table. By the time the new charter was ready, it had been reviewed by a volunteer committee of 18 residents. The final vote passed unanimously. Our community wasn't perfect, but it was finally ours again, transparent, functional, and accountable. As for the barn, it became more than just a landmark. The city designated it a protected structure, and with a little grant money, we installed a weatherproof plaque near the entrance. It told the story not just of the building, but of how the neighborhood stood up against corruption and won. One morning, months later, a group of kids knocked on my door. They were doing a school project on local history and wanted to include the barn. I gave them a tour, showed them the original beams, the hand-carved joinery, the old weather vane still spinning up top. They asked about the trial, the fallout, the vote. I told them the truth, that people make mistakes, that power can go to the wrong heads, but that when good people keep their eyes open and speak up, things can change. Before they left, one of them asked, "Does it feel weird, knowing all this happened because of one building?" I looked up at the barn, standing tall against the morning light. "No," I said. "It happened because people finally stopped looking the other way." And with that, they left clipboards in hand, asking each other which parts of the story to include. I watched them go, then walked back to the barn, hand brushing over the frame. It had stood through storms, fire codes, false accusations, and even fraud. Now it stood for something else. That was enough.